In the autumn of 1887, a young man from Indiana climbed into the Great Smoky Mountains carrying a notebook, a camera, and a list of questions the United States government wanted answered. His name was James Mooney. He had been sent by the Bureau of American Ethnology to record the beliefs of the Cherokee before those beliefs disappeared. And for the most part, that is exactly what he did. He filled hundreds of pages with sacred formulas, medicine songs, and old stories about animals and rivers and stars. But somewhere in those mountains, an old medicine man named Swimmer sat him down and told him something that Washington never quite knew what to do with. He told Mooney that the mountains were not empty. He told him that people lived inside them. Not ghosts, exactly, not spirits in the way we use that word, people, older than the Cherokee, older, in a sense, than the world as it looks now. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And they had been living there, under the stone, since a time before this land took its current shape. Mooney wrote it all down. He published some of it. He buried the rest in footnotes and technical bulletins that almost nobody read for the next 100 years. This is the story of what the Cherokee told James Mooney about what lived inside the mountains. And it is the story of why the version most of us were handed leaves so much of it out, because the deeper you go into his notebooks, the more you start to feel that Mooney recorded two different things at once. He recorded a set of myths, and underneath those myths, almost without meaning to, he recorded a memory of something that was here before, and of who benefited when that memory was quietly filed away. To understand what happened in those mountains, you have to understand the man who went looking. James Mooney was not a trained anthropologist in the way we would think of one today. He was a self-taught, obsessive. As a boy in Richmond, Indiana, he had covered the walls of his room with hand-drawn maps of native nations, memorizing tribes and territories the way other children memorized batting averages. He had no money, no university degree, and no connections. What he had was a hunger to record a world he was convinced was about to be erased, and in the 1880s that world genuinely was disappearing, not by accident, but by policy. By the time Mooney reached the Cherokee, the United States had spent most of a century trying to make the people he was studying stop existing as a distinct nation. The Cherokee he met in North Carolina were the descendants of those who had hidden in the mountains rather than walk the Trail of Tears in 1838. Their grandparents had watched soldiers round up families at gunpoint and march them 1,000 miles west, where a quarter of them died. So when Mooney showed up asking to write down their oldest secrets, he was not walking into a blank page. He was walking into a community that had every reason to distrust a man with a government notebook. That they told him anything at all is remarkable. That they told him what they did is almost unbelievable. The Bureau of American Ethnology had a mission that sounded noble and was, underneath, something colder. It was founded to study native peoples scientifically, but the science of that era served a purpose. If you could prove that the tribes were simple, recent, and primitive, then the land they lived on was not really theirs in any deep sense. It was empty, waiting, available. The whole machinery of American expansion ran on a story, and the story said that the continent had no real history before the settlers arrived. Mooney was hired to help fill in the details of that story. What nobody expected was that the details he brought back would start to contradict it. And to understand just how much money rode on that story, you have to know what had happened in the Cherokee homeland 60 years earlier. In 1828, on Cherokee land in northern Georgia, someone found gold, not a little, enough to trigger one of the first gold rushes in American history. Thousands of prospectors flooded onto Cherokee territory, and the state of Georgia, hungry for the wealth under that ground, moved almost overnight to strip the Cherokee of every legal protection they had. And here is the part that should stick with you. It did not matter that the Cherokee had done everything the settlers claimed to want. They had built farms and towns, and a written constitution. They had a newspaper printed in their own language. Their nation looked, by any fair measure, like a functioning modern society, and it did not save them, because the land had gold in it, and the men who wanted that gold needed a reason to believe the people sitting on top of it did not deserve to be there. That is the engine underneath the Trail of Tears. Not savagery meeting civilization, but civilization meeting a mineral deposit. Keep that in mind, because it is the same engine that would later decide which of the Cherokee's memories counted as history and which got dismissed as fairy tales. He arrived on the Qualla boundary, the strip of land in western North Carolina where the eastern band of the Cherokee still lived, and he did something almost none of his colleagues bothered to do. He stayed. He learned the language. He sat in cabins through long winter nights, while old men who had been born before the removal talked in a tongue that Washington could not read. His most important teacher was a man named Swimmer, in Cherokee, Ayunini. Swimmer was a medicine man, a keeper of the old formulas, and he could not read or write English. But he carried in his memory a library that stretched back generations, and he had a book of his own, written in the Cherokee syllabary, filled with sacred texts he had recorded himself. And that book of Swimmer's points at something the official story worked very hard to talk around. The Cherokee had writing. Not writing borrowed from missionaries, but a system invented from scratch, in a single lifetime, by a Cherokee man named Sequoyah who could not read any language at all when he began. Sometime in the early 1800s, Sequoyah became convinced that the settlers' power came in large part from what he called their talking leaves, their ability to fix speech onto paper. So he set out to build the same thing for his own people. He worked at it for years, was mocked and accused of witchcraft, and kept going anyway. And in the end he produced a syllabary, a character for every sound in the Cherokee language, so well designed that a person could learn to read and write in a matter of days. Within a few years, a huge portion of the Cherokee nation was literate, arguably more literate than many of the settlers pressing in around them. Think about what that does to the story of the simple, timeless savage. A man his society considered ordinary sat down and reinvented one of the foundational technologies of civilization alone and handed it to his entire people. That is not the profile of a culture with no history. That is the profile of a culture perfectly capable of the kind of achievement the moundbuilder myth insisted it could never have managed. It is worth picturing how the recording actually worked, because it did not happen quickly, and it did not happen because Mooney was clever. It happened because he stayed, and because he was patient in a way almost no one from his world had been. At first the older Cherokee gave him the surface, animal stories, things a child could hear. The real material, the sacred formulas and the accounts of the immortals, was not something you handed to a stranger with a government badge. It took years. It took Mooney learning the language well enough to catch what was being said around him, and not only to him. It took Swimmer deciding, for reasons that were his own, that it was better for this knowledge to survive in a white man's book than to vanish entirely when the last person who carried it died. That was the bargain, spoken or not. The old people were watching their world end. They had seen the soldiers, the removal, the treaties broken as fast as they were signed. And some of them made the hard calculation that a written record kept by an outsider was a lifeboat, even if they did not trust the man holding the pen. So they talked. And Mooney, to his lasting credit, wrote it down straight, without cleaning it up to fit what Washington wanted to hear. Mooney later wrote that when Swimmer died, an entire library of knowledge died with him, and that he considered the man one of the most important people he had ever known. That is a striking thing for a government scientist to say about an illiterate mountain healer. But Mooney meant it, because Swimmer was the one who first told him about the Nunahi. The Nunahi. The word is usually translated as the immortals, or sometimes as the people who live anywhere. And according to everything the Cherokee told Mooney, they were not a legend in the way we mean legend. They were neighbors. Invisible neighbors, most of the time, but neighbors all the same. The Nunahi lived inside the mountains. Not on them, inside them. They had townhouses under the high peaks and under the deep bends of the rivers, whole settlements hidden beneath the stone, with their own council fires and their own dances. And the Cherokee could tell you exactly which mountains they lived in. Think about what that means for a second. This was not a vague belief in something out there in the wilderness. It was specific. The Nunahi lived under Pilot Knob. They lived under Blood Mountain, at the head of the Nottely River, in a place the Cherokee called the home of the immortals. They lived beneath the old mound at Nikquasi. Hunters told Mooney about walking past certain peaks and hearing drumming coming from somewhere deep inside the rock, faint singing, the sound of a dance going on underground, in a townhouse no living person had ever entered. They would stop and listen, and the sound would fade, and when they looked for the entrance there was nothing there but mountainside. And the list of named places went on and on. There was Standing Indian, a bald mountain, the Cherokee tied to an old story of a monster in the sky, and a lookout who was turned to stone at his post. There were stone walls and terraces on certain high peaks that nobody living had built and nobody could quite explain. There was Track Rock Gap, where boulders carried footprints and shapes pressed into the stone, marks the Cherokee attributed to the beings and the animals of the old time. Every one of these was a fixed point on a real map. You could walk to them. The Cherokee were not gesturing vaguely at the horizon and inventing wonders to entertain a visitor. They were naming coordinates, this peak, that gap, this bend in that particular river. And at each coordinate sat a piece of the same larger story, an older presence, a hidden people, a way into the earth. When a belief is that specific, that tied to real geography, and that consistent from one teller to the next across a whole nation, it stops behaving the way a fairy tale behaves, and starts behaving like a map of something. The only question the official record never wanted to ask out loud was, a map of what? Mooney collected accounts that went further than distant drumming. There were stories of people who had actually gone in and come back. A man lost and freezing in the mountains, taken in by strangers who fed him and sheltered him in a warm townhouse, only to wake at dawn on the bare hillside with no house anywhere in sight. A sick or grieving person led to the Nunahi and healed, returning changed. And the Cherokee were clear that the immortals did not only live under the mountains, they lived under the water too, in townhouses beneath the deep pools of the rivers and under the lakes, and there were places where, if the water was still and clear, you might glimpse the tops of their lodges far below the surface. Underground and underwater, an entire parallel society, going about its life just out of reach, occasionally reaching back. It is the kind of thing that is very easy to laugh off from a distance. It is a good deal harder to laugh off when you notice how calmly and how consistently and in how much detail sober people described it to a man taking careful notes. Now, the easy thing to do here is to smile and call this a charming myth, and Mooney, to his credit, did not entirely do that. He noticed something that a lazier man would have missed. The Cherokee did not describe the Nunahi the way people usually describe gods or monsters. They described them the way you describe a rival town. The Nunahi were friendly, mostly. They helped travellers who got lost in blizzards, guiding them to warmth and then vanishing. They took pity on starving hunters. They were said to have come to the aid of the Cherokee in battle more than once. They had personalities. They had rules. They had a society. And it was, in every description, older and in some ways greater than the one the Cherokee themselves had built. That last part is the piece that should stop you. Over and over, the stories describe the people inside the mountains as the ones who came first. The Cherokee were the newcomers. The Nunahi were already here, already established, already living in their stone towns, when the ancestors of the Cherokee arrived in these mountains, which raises a question that the official record was never very interested in asking. If the Cherokee remembered themselves as newcomers to a land that already had inhabitants, who did they think those earlier inhabitants were? And why did they insist those inhabitants had gone underground rather than simply vanished? Hold on to that question, because it only gets stranger from here. The single most famous Nunahi story that Mooney recorded happened at a place called Nikquasi. Today it is a grass-covered mound in the middle of the town of Franklin, North Carolina, sitting quietly between a road and a river, mowed like a lawn, with a historical marker beside it. Most people who drive past it have no idea what they are looking at. But to the Cherokee, Nikquasi was one of the oldest and most sacred townhouse sites in the entire nation, and it sat directly on top of a Nunahi settlement. The story goes like this. Long ago, an enemy war party came down out of the north to attack the town at Nikquasi. The Cherokee warriors turned out to defend it, but they were badly outnumbered, and the fight was going against them. Then, From the mound itself, from the townhouse of the immortals underneath it, the Nunahi came out. An army of them, invisible or nearly so, poured up from inside the mountain and fell on the enemy. The attackers found themselves being cut down by warriors they could not see, arrows coming from empty air. They broke and ran, and the Nunahi are said to have pursued them, protecting the town, until the threat was gone entirely. There is a detail in that story that Mooney recorded almost in passing, and it is the detail that stays with you. The Cherokee said that when the Nunahi came out to fight, the enemy warriors who survived reported that their own arrows passed straight through the defenders. And when it was over, the Nunahi went back inside the mound and closed it behind them, and the town was saved. Now, you can read that as pure folklore, but sit with the underlying claim. A people remembered that their most sacred site was built on top of the home of an older, hidden population who could come and go from inside the earth, and who had once defended them. They did not build a temple to a distant god there. They built their town on the roof of their neighbours. And here is where the story stops being just a beautiful piece of mythology and starts becoming something that makes historians uncomfortable. Because Nikquasi is a mound, a human-made earthwork. And in the 1880s, when Mooney was writing all of this down, the question of who built the mounds of North America was one of the most bitterly contested arguments in the entire country. It was not a quiet academic debate. It was a fight about who this continent belonged to, and it had enormous amounts of money and land riding on the answer. To see why, you have to understand the myth of the mound builders. Across the eastern United States, from the Great Lakes down through the Mississippi Valley and into the southeast, early settlers kept finding them. Enormous earthworks. Geometric enclosures aligned to the movements of the sun and moon. Mounds shaped like animals stretching for hundreds of feet. Flat-topped pyramids of packed earth that rivaled anything in Mexico. Whoever built these things had commanded labor, engineering, astronomy, and organization on a massive scale. And it is worth slowing down on just how much these builders actually accomplished, because the scale is the part that got quietly minimized. Cahokia, near Modern Street. Louis, at its height around the year 1100, may have held more people than any city in what is now the United States would hold again until Philadelphia in the late 1700s. It had suburbs. It had a central plaza the size of dozens of football fields. It had a great mound, Monk's Mound, rising in terraces to the height of a 10-story building, still the largest earthwork in the Americas north of Mexico, covering more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its builders tracked the sun with a ring of wooden posts precise enough that we now call it an American woodhenge, and Cahokia was not alone. There were mound cities and ceremonial centers up and down the great rivers, connected by trade routes that carried copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, and stone from the Rockies. This was a networked world, a continent that had cities, astronomy, long-distance commerce, and monumental architecture, centuries before the first Europeans set foot on it. The mounds Mooney's contemporaries were arguing about were the tombstones of that world, and the Cherokee, pointing at Nikquasi, were among the last people still telling anyone who would listen that the world had been real and that it had been theirs. And the dominant response among white Americans in the 1800s was to decide, almost unanimously, that the native peoples they saw around them could not possibly have done it. It was, they said, impossible. These were simple savages. So the mounds must have been built by someone else, a lost race. A vanished superior civilization that had come before, built these wonders, and then been wiped out or driven off by the ancestors of the very tribes now living among the ruins. Books were written. Newspapers ran the theory as fact. People proposed that the true mound builders had been wandering Israelites, or refugees from Atlantis, or a lost white race, or ancient voyagers from the old world. Stop and notice what that story does. It takes the single strongest piece of evidence for indigenous civilization, the monumental architecture standing right there in the ground, and it hands that evidence to somebody else. It says these people you are removing from their land are not the descendants of builders and city planners and astronomers. They are latecomers, squatters, even, living in the shadow of a greatness that was never theirs. And if that is true, then taking their land is not really theft. It is just history repeating a change of tenants. This is the part that belongs in a conversation about economics and power, not just folklore. The mound builder myth was not a harmless mistake. It was worth a fortune. It provided the moral cover for the largest transfer of land in modern history. Between the founding of the Republic and the end of the century, hundreds of millions of acres passed from native nations to settlers, railroads, land companies, and the federal government. Every one of those acres was easier to take if the people you were taking it from had no deep claim to it. The lost race theory manufactured exactly that convenience. It turned dispossession into a kind of natural succession, and it did it while wearing the costume of neutral science. And the Cherokee, in their own mountains, were telling James Mooney the opposite story to his face. They were pointing at Nikquasi, a mound, and saying, "Our sacred town sits on the home of the ancient ones who were here before us." They were not attributing the earthworks to some vanished European race. They were folding the mounds into a continuous memory that ran from the immortals inside the mountains straight through to the people talking to Mooney in the winter of 1887. In their telling, there was no lost race. There was only a continuous, unbroken presence, part of which had gone underground, and part of which was still sitting in the cabin, talking. Here is the twist that almost nobody knows. The Bureau of American Ethnology, the same institution that sent Mooney, was at that exact moment running a massive project to settle the mound builder question once and for all. A scientist named Cyrus Thomas led a survey that excavated mounds across the entire eastern United States through the 1880s and early 1890s. And in 1894, Thomas published his conclusion. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the native peoples who still lived in those regions. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. There was no lost race. There never had been. The Cherokee and their neighbors had been telling the truth all along, and the entire lost civilization industry had been, in the polite language of the report, without foundation. So think about the position James Mooney was in. He was working for the one institution that had just officially proven the native memory correct, and he was sitting in the mountains listening to the keepers of that memory describe, in their own words, the continuous history that Thomas had confirmed with a shovel. Two halves of the same truth, arriving at the same institution at the same time. And yet the story that reached the public, the story that still sits in most textbooks, kept the mounds and kept the debunking, but quietly dropped the part where the people themselves had been saying it all along, and had wrapped that history in a memory of beings who lived inside the earth. That is the pattern this whole story keeps repeating. The facts survive, the testimony survives, but the frame gets changed. The living memory gets reclassified as quaint mythology, and the quaint mythology gets filed where it will not disturb anyone. And once you see that pattern one time, you start seeing it everywhere in Mooney's work. Take the little people. Alongside the Nunahi, the Cherokee told Mooney about the Yunwi-Tsunsdi, which means the little people, and they were careful to explain that these were a different population from the immortals inside the mountains. The little people were small, barely reaching a grown person's knee, with long hair that sometimes trailed to the ground. They lived in caves and rock shelters up on the mountainsides. They were fond of music, and hunters would sometimes hear their drums beating deep in the cliffs, the same underground drumming that echoed through so many of these accounts. They could be helpful, and they could be dangerous if disrespected, and there were strict rules about how to behave if you ever came across their homes or their belongings in the woods. Again, notice how specific this is. The Cherokee did not lump every mysterious being into one category. They had a taxonomy. There were the immortals, the Nunahi, who lived under the largest mountains in whole towns. There were the little people, the Yunwi-Tsunsdi, who lived in the rock faces in smaller groups. There were water dwellers, and there were beings tied to particular springs and rivers and bald mountain tops. This is not how people talk about vague superstition. This is how people talk about a landscape they believe is populated, a landscape with a hidden census. And there is a question underneath all of this that is worth asking out loud. Why underground? Why, when this culture wanted to describe the people who came before, did they so consistently put them inside the earth and under the water, rather than simply say they had died or moved away? It would have been easier to remember a vanished people as ancestors, in the ordinary sense. Instead, again and again, the older ones are described as still here, but hidden, sealed inside the mountains, living below the rivers, present but out of reach. That is a strange and specific way to remember a predecessor, and it happens to echo something you find in the deep memory of cultures all over the world, this image of an older, greater people who did not exactly disappear but withdrew, going into the hills, under the ground, beyond a threshold that only occasionally opens. You can dismiss that as coincidence, human brains reaching for the same handful of metaphors. Or you can wonder, quietly, whether so many peoples landed on the same image because they were all reaching for the same kind of event. The arrival of a new population in a land that was not empty, and the strange, lingering sense that the ones who came before had not entirely gone. And then there is the story that, of everything Mooney recorded, sounds the most like the memory of an actual event. It concerns a town of Cherokee who, according to the account, chose to go inside the mountain and never came back out. The way it was told, the people of a certain town had grown weary of the hardship of ordinary life. So they fasted and prayed for many days, and the Nunahi came to them and invited them to come and live inside the mountain, where there was no more hunger, no more war, no more death. And the townspeople agreed. They went to the mountain, and the mountain opened, and they walked inside, and it closed behind them, and they became immortals too. Some versions say that as they were being led in, a few of them looked back, or hesitated, and were left behind to tell the tale. You can hear that story on at least two levels. On one level, it is a spiritual parable about seeking a better world. But listen to it as a historian for a moment, stripped of the supernatural gloss. A community, under pressure, disappears into the mountains, into a hidden refuge, and passes out of ordinary sight. The people left behind remember them as having gone to live with an older population that dwelt underground. Now remember who was telling this story. The Eastern Band Cherokee were, quite literally, the people who had gone into the mountains and refused to come out. Their entire existence as a community was the result of hiding in the high country while the rest of their nation was marched west. The memory of vanishing into the mountains to survive was not ancient to them. It was their grandparents. I am not saying the story of the town inside the mountain is a coded account of the removal. It is far older than that. But I am saying that these people had a deep, layered, repeated cultural memory of the mountains as a place of refuge, of hidden populations, of doorways that open and close, and of an older people already living inside when you arrive. That memory did not come from nowhere. Cultures do not invent the same specific image over and over across centuries for no reason. Something anchored it, and Mooney, sitting there with his notebook, was recording the anchor without ever being allowed to ask what it was attached to. Then the stories get bigger, literally. Because the Cherokee did not only tell Mooney about immortals and little people, they told him about giants. There was a being called Tzul-Kalu, whose name Mooney translated as the slant-eyed giant, sometimes rendered as he has them slanting. Tzul-Kalu was a lord of the hunt, a giant who lived in the mountains and controlled the game animals, and he was associated with a very specific, very real place. On the side of a mountain in Jackson County, North Carolina, there is a large soapstone boulder covered in carvings. Deep grooves, cut marks, lines and shapes cut into the rock by human hands a very long time ago. The Cherokee called it the place where Tzul-Kalu had left his marks. Today it is known as Judaculla Rock, Judaculla being an English mangling of Tzul-Kalu, and it is one of the most significant pieces of rock art in the eastern United States, and one of the least understood. Nobody knows for certain what the carvings on Judaculla Rock mean, or exactly how old they are. Estimates run into the thousands of years, but the Cherokee had an answer that the archaeologists did not. They said a giant made them, a giant who lived in the mountains, who was there before, who was tied to the deep past of the land. And here we are again, at the same intersection. A genuine, physical, unexplained ancient monument, and an indigenous memory that connects it to an older, larger, hidden people, and a modern establishment that files the memory under folklore and the rock under unsolved. There is one more figure in Mooney's notebooks that we have to talk about, because it is the closest the Cherokee came to describing a piece of lost technology. It was called the Uktena, a giant serpent, they said, thick as a tree trunk, with horns and a blazing crest, that lived in deep pools and lonely mountain passes. And set in the forehead of the Uktena was a diamond-like crystal called the Ulun Suti, the most powerful object a person could possess. Whoever could take the crystal from the serpent, and almost nobody could, would hold the power to see the future, to find lost things, to bring rain, to succeed at any hunt or war. The crystal had to be fed, kept wrapped, kept hidden, treated almost like a living thing, or it would turn on its owner. This was not a toy in the stories. It was the ultimate instrument of knowledge and power, guarded by a monster, obtainable only at terrible risk, and passed down as one of the great secrets of the medicine people. Strip away the serpent, and what you are left with is a memory of a fantastically valuable object of foresight and power, dangerous, closely guarded, tied to the oldest and deepest layer of Cherokee knowledge. The same layer that the priestly class was said to have controlled before it fell. The same layer that kept going quiet and quieter the longer these people were pushed and hunted and dispossessed. Now let me bring in the piece of Cherokee history that ties all of this together, because it is the piece that sounds the least like a myth and the most like something that actually happened. The Cherokee told Mooney about a priestly caste called the Anikutani. In the old days, before the arrangement of society that existed in Mooney's time, the Anikutani were a hereditary order of priests who held enormous power. They controlled the sacred knowledge, the ceremonies, the formulas, the connection between the people and the deeper forces of the world. They were, in effect, a ruling class based on secret knowledge. And according to the tradition, they became corrupt. They abused their power, took what they wanted, and lorded it over the common people, until one day the people rose up and destroyed them, overthrew them completely, and ended their rule forever. Read that carefully, because it is extraordinary. This is an indigenous North American people preserving the memory of a political revolution, a memory of an earlier, more hierarchical, more centralized, knowledge-controlling social order that was overthrown and replaced. That is not the kind of thing that simple, static, timeless societies are supposed to remember, according to the story that the Bureau of American Ethnology was built to tell. That is the memory of a civilization with a history, with eras, with a before and an after, with a lost age of powerful priests and a revolution that ended them. And notice what was lost when the Anikutani fell: the sacred knowledge, the formulas, the deep understanding of the world that the priestly class had hoarded. When they were destroyed, much of what they knew died with them, and the people who came after had only fragments. Does that sound familiar? It is the same shape as the story of the mounds, and the story of the immortals inside the mountains. Something greater came before. It was centralized, knowledgeable, monumental. It was lost, or hidden, or overthrown. And what remained was a people living among the ruins and the memories, holding on to pieces of a whole they could no longer fully assemble. This is the point where we have to talk honestly about the frame this whole subject sits inside. Because there is a modern idea, popular and controversial, that goes by the name of a lost empire the mainstream refuses to acknowledge. A worldwide older civilization that was more advanced than we are told, whose remains were reclassified, rebranded, and absorbed into the official story, with the true history buried because it was inconvenient to the people writing the textbooks. Most versions of that idea overreach wildly. They grab at buildings and monuments that have perfectly good explanations and cry conspiracy. And I want to be careful and honest with you here, rather than sell you something easy. But strip that idea down to its hard core, and something real is left standing. The hard core is this: history is written by institutions, and institutions have interests. The people who decide which memories count as history and which get demoted to myth are not neutral. They are funded by someone, they answer to someone, and the version of the past they produce tends, on average, to serve the people who paid for it. That is not a wild theory. That is just how the sausage of official history has always been made, And in the specific case of 19th century America, we do not have to guess about the motive, because the motive was written into the laws and the land deeds. The continent was being taken, and a continent is easier to take if its original inhabitants have no deep past. And the taking did not stop with the gold and the land. Once the Cherokee and their neighbors were pushed aside or hemmed in, the mountains themselves were opened up and emptied out. The timber companies came for the old-growth forests, and within a couple of generations they had clear-cut enormous stretches of the southern Appalachians, hauling the wood out on new railroads built specifically to reach it. The mineral rights were carved up. Whole valleys were bought for pennies and stripped. If you want to understand why a certain memory of the mountains had to be turned into a fairy tale, follow the money out of them. A landscape full of sacred sites, ancient builders, and living memory is a landscape people fight to protect. A landscape that is just empty scenery, dotted with the quaint legends of a vanished people, is a landscape you can log, mine, dam, and sell without anyone feeling they have lost something sacred. The story of an emptied past and the physical emptying of the mountains were not two separate things. They were the same project, running at the same time, and they needed each other. You cannot strip a cathedral for parts while people still believe it is a cathedral. First, you have to convince everyone it was only ever a pile of interesting old rocks. So the Cherokee memory of the immortals inside the mountains, the older people who came first, the lost priestly civilization, the giants who carved the rocks, the towns that vanished into the peaks, all of it sat in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. It was testimony to depth, continuity, and lost greatness, delivered by the very people whose land was being justified as empty and without history. Of course, it got filed under mythology. Filing it anywhere else would have been expensive. I am not asking you to believe that there are literally immortal beings living in townhouses under the Smoky Mountains. I am asking you to notice something more unsettling and more defensible. That an entire people across many generations maintained a detailed, specific, consistent memory of an older population that predated them in these mountains and had partly gone into the earth. That this memory was attached to real physical anchors, the mounds, the carved rocks, the specific named peaks. That the one federal institution positioned to evaluate that memory confirmed its central factual claim that native peoples were the ancient builders, and then let the surrounding testimony be quietly recategorized as folklore, and that this recategorization happened to line up perfectly with the financial and territorial interests of the people doing the categorizing. Those are not supernatural claims, those are historical observations. And they are enough, on their own, to make you look at that quiet grass mound in Franklin, North Carolina, very differently. And here is a detail that should bother anyone who cares about how we come to know what we know. A great deal of what Mooney and his colleagues gathered did not go to the public. It went into an archive. Boxes of notes, recordings, sacred material, sometimes taken with consent and sometimes not, flowed into Washington and were catalogued, and there a lot of it simply sat. Some of it was published in dense technical bulletins that no ordinary person would ever open. Some of it was considered too sensitive, or too unimportant, or too inconvenient, and was never published at all. For generations, the descendants of the people these materials came from could not easily get access to their own ancestors' words. The knowledge had been extracted, the way ore is extracted, and stored somewhere the people who produced it could not reach. That is its own kind of taking, and it means that the version of these mountains and these beliefs that reached the general public was never the full record. It was a curated sliver, chosen by an institution with its own priorities. When you read the polished summary that calls the Nunahi a charming legend, you are reading the end product of a long chain of decisions about what to keep loud and what to keep quiet. James Mooney felt all of this too. As the years went on, something shifted in the way he worked. He was supposed to be a detached recorder, extracting data from a dying culture for the archive, but he did not stay detached. He kept going deeper into the material, taking it more and more seriously on its own terms, until his colleagues in Washington started to worry about him. He learned the ceremonies. He earned the trust of the medicine people. He came to write about the Cherokee not as specimens but as the holders of a genuine, coherent, sophisticated understanding of the world that the science of his day was too arrogant to actually learn from. And then, in 1890, He stepped into something that would define the rest of his life and would show him, in real time, exactly how the machine of official history dealt with an indigenous belief it found inconvenient. He went to study the ghost dance. The ghost dance was a religious movement that had swept across the native nations of the West. Its prophet taught that if the people danced and lived rightly, a new world was coming. The dead would return, the buffalo would come back, and the land would be restored to how it had been before the settlers. It was a movement of hope among people who had lost almost everything, and the United States government responded to it with fear, because a unifying spiritual movement among the tribes was the last thing the machinery of expansion wanted. That fear led, in December 1890, to the massacre at Wounded Knee, where soldiers killed hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children, many of them believers in the ghost dance. Mooney went out and did what he did best. He listened. He travelled among the shattered communities and recorded the ghost dance religion with the same care he had given the Cherokee. And he came back and wrote a report that was, for its time, radical. He treated the ghost dance not as savage delusion, but as a rational, even beautiful, response to catastrophe, comparable to religious movements throughout human history. He humanized the very belief that his own government had just committed a massacre over. It did not make him popular in Washington. The man who had gone to the mountains to record a dying belief had become, in a sense, a defender of belief itself, a defender of the idea that these memories and visions were not garbage to be swept into a footnote, but knowledge, testimony, evidence of a human depth the official story could not afford to admit. He paid for that over the rest of his career. He clashed with the establishment. His methods and his sympathies made him suspect. When he tried to publish sacred material from other nations in ways the Bureau found politically dangerous, they blocked it, and much of his later work was suppressed or left unpublished in his lifetime. James Mooney, the man who wrote down what the Cherokee said, lived inside the mountains, spent his final years watching the same institution that had sent him steadily bury the deeper implications of everything he had brought back. He died in 1921, and a great deal of what he had gathered stayed in the archives, technically preserved, practically forgotten. Which brings us back to the mountains, and to the question we started with. What did the Cherokee actually tell James Mooney lived inside them? They told him it was people, older than the Cherokee, living in stone townhouses under the largest peaks, with their own councils and their own dances, sometimes heard drumming faintly through the rock. They told him these older people had been here first, that the Cherokee themselves were the newcomers, and that the boundary between the two worlds was thin, that whole towns had passed through it and never returned. They told him about a lost priestly civilization, powerful and knowledgeable, that ruled and then fell, taking its deepest knowledge into the ground with it. They told him about giants who carved the rocks and controlled the hunt, and about a horned serpent guarding a crystal that could show a person the future. And they anchored every piece of it to real, specific, physical places you can still drive to today, mounds and boulders and named mountains, monuments whose true age and origin the official world still shrugs at. Now, the mainstream reading of all this is simple and comfortable. It is folklore, beautiful, meaningful folklore, the imaginative furniture of a pre-scientific people, no more literally true than any nation's old stories of fairies under the hills. And maybe that reading is entirely correct. I'm not going to stand here and tell you there is a hidden city under Blood Mountain, but I want to leave you with the harder, quieter thought that Mooney's own life points toward, which is that the difference between history and folklore is not always about what is true. Sometimes it is about who is telling it, and who benefits from the label. Because think about what would have had to be different for these Cherokee accounts to be treated as history rather than myth. They would have had to be told by a people whose land was not being taken. They would have had to serve the interests of the institutions doing the recording rather than threaten them. They would have had to arrive at a moment when America could afford to believe that this continent had a deep and continuous and indigenous civilization, rather than a moment when the entire economy of expansion depended on believing the opposite. Change any one of those conditions, and the same words out of Swimmer's mouth might be sitting in our textbooks as the earliest historical memory of the American mountains, instead of a charming legend in the back of an old government report. That is the real thing that lived inside the mountains. Not just the immortals, and the little people, and the giants, but a version of the past that did not fit the story the country had decided to tell about itself. A memory of depth, continuity, and lost greatness, kept alive by the very people it was most dangerous to believe. James Mooney climbed into those mountains to record a world that was supposedly dying. And what he actually found, whether he was fully allowed to say it or not, was a world insisting that it had always been here, that something older than all of it was sleeping under the stone, and that the emptiness the map-makers had drawn over these hills was the biggest myth of all. So when you stand in front of that mound, or in front of Judaculla Rock, or on a trail below one of the named peaks where the drumming was said to come up through the stone, you are standing at the exact seam where two versions of the past meet. One version is written on the historical marker, safe and small and settled. The other version is the one the people who lived here longest kept trying to tell, the one about an older world that built the mounds, hoarded the deep knowledge, carved the rocks, and then went into the mountains rather than out of existence. We were handed the first version because it was cheaper and because the people who wrote the checks preferred it. But the second version never actually went away. It is still there in Mooney's own notebooks, in swimmers' remembered words, in the specific and stubborn insistence that these mountains were never empty and never new. You just have to be willing to read past the word legend and ask why that particular word got stamped on that particular truth, and who was standing to profit at the exact moment the stamp came down. It is a strange inheritance to carry, once you actually see it. Most of us grew up with a version of American history that begins, more or less, with ships arriving on an empty coast, a wilderness waiting to be tamed, a blank continent handed to whoever was bold enough to take it. And almost none of that is true. The coast was not empty. The continent was not blank. It held cities and roads and observatories and nations with long memories, and it held, in the mouths of men like Swimmer, a record of an even older world beneath that one. The blankness was never a fact. It was a decision. Somebody had to work to make the past look empty, because an empty past is the one thing that turns a taking into a settling. And what Mooney carried down out of those mountains, almost by accident, was the receipt for that work. Proof, in careful handwriting, that the people who had been on this land the longest never believed for a moment that it was empty, and had been telling anyone who bothered to listen exactly what was here before them, and underneath them, the entire time. The mound at Nikquasi is still there. You can visit it. It sits in the middle of an ordinary town, mowed and marked and easy to miss, with a river running past it and traffic going by. Underneath it, the Cherokee said, is the townhouse of an older people who once came out of the earth to defend the ones who lived above. The historians will tell you it is a burial and ceremonial mound, built by the ancestors of the people who told the story. And the strange thing, the thing worth sitting with, is that both of those explanations were confirmed by the same government, in the same decade, through the same institution. One of them we kept and put on the marker. The other we quietly agreed to call a legend. What the Cherokee told James Mooney was that the two were never separate at all. The mountains remember, and the people who lived in their shadow remembered with them, long after everyone with a reason to forget had decided the memory was only a story. The stone keeps its own counsel, and the drumming, if you believe the people who knew this land best, has never entirely stopped.